Hello, everybody. Good evening. I'm Stephen. Thank you for joining me. This is a discussion. It was intended to be a discussion all about George Foreman, the oldest heavyweight champion in history, entrepreneur, Christian preacher, known for so many things, who passed away last week. And I was supposed to be joined by an expert boxing commentator and friend and former colleague of mine as well. And sadly, they are not able to join me for this discussion. So it's going to be a solo expedition, this one today. And what I'm proposing to do, really, without making this overly formal or too structured, is to simply talk through what I think some of the significance of George Foreman's life, his career in boxing, and outside the ring as well, and say a little bit about his story, his character arc, if you like, and then really touch on a few points of significance for me, which I think are really, really relevant to. You can tell I've not done these for a while. So, touch on a few points of significance that I think are worth drawing out, really, and that really resonate with me, at least. So, some quick housekeeping before I start properly. I'm going to put this on YouTube. You may even be watching this on YouTube now. Some of you may be joining live. I do encourage you, do comment, do message me, no heckling and all the usual rules. But if you're watching live, please do comment, please do ask questions. I really love these things being interactive. So I'm here this evening for at least the next 20 minutes or so. I think it's going to be longer. We're going to be talking about George Foreman, his life, his career, and why it matters. And why it matters as well, even to people who aren't necessarily big boxing fans, who aren't even sports fans as well. So from the top, I think a lot of people will have seen George Foreman's had a very, very eventful life, had a very extraordinary career. So just to reel off some statistics here, as I said, he is still to this day the oldest heavyweight champion in history, winning the world title at 45 years old. In the two eras that he won the heavyweight title, in the 70s and almost 20 years later in the 1990s, historically, those two eras would, almost everybody would say, were the two most competitive, best eras in heavyweight boxing. You had Muhammad Ali, you had Joe Frazier, you had Ken Norton, and others in the 70s. Fast forward 2 decades, in the 90s, you've got a very spicy era there. You've got Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis. You've got a bit of the Klitschko's towards the end of the 90s as well. So, first off, George Foreman managed to win titles in two different eras, probably the best eras maybe there will ever be in heavyweight boxing. So in the ring, it was really, really remarkable. And one of the things I'm struck with as I begin to go into what Foreman's story is, it's a well-trodden path, I suppose, isn't it? That people who achieve fantastic things in sport or in business or in other fields in life often come from very humble beginnings, and that was very much the same thing for George Foreman. He was born in a place called Marshall in Texas, not far from Houston, in 1949. He had six siblings, and listen, he by all accounts he grew up in a tough neighborhood, something called the Fifth Ward, and I've read and I've heard that he was, physically beaten by his mum as he was growing up. He was in and out of school, bunking off and playing truant. And one thing which really struck him when he was young was, as he was bunking off school, people around him, I guess, in his family, didn't really care that much about it. The the memory being, as he describes it, was that, oh, it doesn't really matter that much anyway. You know, it's George isn't going to make much of himself when he grows up. Nobody round here in this neighbourhood really amounts to anything, so it doesn't really matter. Don't go to school. And so that was one of the things which really stayed with Foreman, according to by his own from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And he turned to a life of crime when he was younger. He was literally a street fighter. As he became a teenager, he used to rob people, mug people on the street. He had brushes with the law, and so he had a very troubled youth. And I suppose, again, from what I can read and listening to people who knew him, he grew up with a lot of anger, and that's something I'll return to later on in this discussion here. That was a theme for George Foreman in his younger years. He was somebody who carried a lot of anger with him, and I suppose he sought to unleash that anger out on people who were standing opposite him in the boxing ring. So George Foreman managed to have a really lucky intervention, I suppose. When he was 16, he managed to get onto this, I guess you would call it like an apprenticeship or job training program. When President Lyndon Johnson was president, it was something called the Job Corps, and this was something that Foreman signed up to and really got enthusiastically into, and he managed to train to become a carpenter and a bricklayer, and he actually got to go to Washington to meet President Johnson, and it was something that he was clearly very proud of. He was this strong patriotic feeling he had was, and I'm fast forwarding some years now, was something that Foreman brought into his amateur boxing career, because he represented the United States and he won the gold medal for America in the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games. I'm just navigating here. Let's see if there's any comments. Okay, on we go. So Foreman won the gold medal in '68, and you know, one of the interesting things, striking things about his run to winning the gold medal was that, except for the very first round, he knocked out every single opponent he had to face, including a chap from the Soviet Union in the final. So Foreman was already in the amateurs, was demolishing his way through everyone who was in front of him, and that wrecking ball style theme, that sense of Foreman being a destroyer, a wrecking ball, as I say, and having tremendous punching power, was something that Foreman brought right into his pro ranks. So to get the dates right here, and again, I'm fast forwarding through a lot here to only communicate the really meaningful things as I see it. You know, Foreman won his first 37 fights, and there's a lot of knockouts on the way there before he fights Joe Frazier for the title. And this fight against Frazier, which was in 1973, was actually in Kingston in Jamaica. This was probably George Foreman's most significant win of his career, certainly in the first phase of his boxing career. Frazier would have been a heavily favoured opponent going into this fight in Jamaica. Frazier had already beaten Muhammad Ali, and while George Foreman had beaten a lot of opponents and got, you know, lots of knockouts and a lot of momentum behind them, Frazier was still very much the odds-on favourite, and George Foreman was, you know, somebody who was perceived to have not really been tested. And for boxing fans who probably, for whatever reason, if you've not already seen this, go and watch this fight against Frazier. This is a significant moment. Foreman absolutely demolishes Joe Frazier, handing him his first loss inside 2 rounds. It includes 6 knockdowns, and I think at one point, this is something people really highlight, was Joe Frazier actually gets lifted off of his feet briefly as well. Such is the power that Foreman has. He's able to lift the late great Joe Frazier off his feet and absolutely demolishes him. And then fast forward that to the following year in '74, Foreman, as the champion, fights Ken Norton in Caracas, Venezuela, which is quite interesting. And again, absolutely takes out Ken Norton in 2 rounds again. So to highlight, to pause here on the significance of this, Joe Frazier and Ken Norton, who had both fought Ali, and there were 2 opponents at that stage who Ali had not even come close to stopping before, and then you've got this up and comer George Foreman, 24, 25 years old, this murderous puncher, takes out Joe Frazier, takes out Ken Norton in a maximum of like 4 rounds. And so, Muhammad Ali was sat ringside for the Ken Norton fight there, and that seemed to be the very obvious fight to make them. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to be very transparent with you that I'm going to pause here and take a bit of a breath, because I've been talking for 11 minutes straight and I've barely stopped for breath. And this is part of the reason why I'm doing these videos, to get used to what it feels like to take my time and communicate and chat about things that I'm enthusiastic about and that I'm hopefully have some knowledge about as well. So I'm going to be very transparent and narrate what I'm doing here to just slow down the tempo here. It's okay. I see there's not too many viewers here in front of me. I'm willing to make the mistakes here. Which brings us to, very well timed pause there, I do say so. This brings us to the Rumble in the Jungle. Now this, I think it is fair to say, I think this is something that few people dispute. The Rumble in the Jungle is possibly the most famous fight that there's ever been in boxing history. Going further than that, the Rumble in the Jungle, Muhammad Ali against against George Foreman in October 1974. Going further than that, this is arguably the biggest, most infamous sporting event that there's been in history. There's a whole mythology around this. The way this fight was put together, Don King was one of the promoters. It was hosted in Zaire, which is now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in the present day here. And the dictator at the time, who had even for dictators, even where they're concerned, had an absolutely ruthless reputation, put up $10 million to pay each fighter $5 million each, which was a lot of money back then in the 70s. And there's been books written about this. I've listened to so many podcasts and interviews about this event, the whole thing, and it was just absolutely extraordinary how all these events transpired and what happened. So let me run through what I'm talking about. First thing I want to say is that the Rumble in the Jungle was actually postponed for 5 weeks. George Foreman sustained a very bad cut when he was preparing for this fight. So first thing to highlight here is, for about 30 odd days leading up to the rescheduled date, George Foreman has a bad cut, and he actually, as it transpires, doesn't do any sparring in that final 5 weeks at all. Very, very significant. And more than that, not only the fighters, but even the global foreign media, or at least most of them, were totally unable. They were not allowed to leave the country. The dictator Mobutu, I think I'm pronouncing that right, had put up a lot of money into this and was, I believe, took the view that particularly if he lost either fighter leaving the country, that they wouldn't come back essentially, and the fight would be lost, and whatever good publicity he could get from this would be lost. So not only did he not let Foreman or Ali leave the country, he didn't let any of the world's media leave as well. So you had people getting cabin fever and being stuck in this very hot, very strange environment to what Western people in particular were used to. So that was another thing. The other striking thing, and I'm jumping around a little bit here, is but before going into the actual fight itself, to go to the end of the fight, there was a monsoon rain which struck the stadium of I want to get this name right, Kinshasa in Zaire, about an hour after the fight finished, which was about 5 o'clock in the morning local time. There was a tremendous monsoon which struck Zaire, and people who were there remarked at the time that had that rain hit only momentarily before, the whole fight would have been called off and unable to take place. So you have that as well. Getting into the actual mechanics of it as well, Foreman was known for being a murderous puncher. He wasn't the most skillful. He wasn't like a Floyd Mayweather, Pernell Whitaker. He wasn't known for being slick. Ali, particularly when he was younger, was clearly known for being up on his toes and moving around a lot. The old move like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And the interesting thing of this was Muhammad Ali's own camp prepared him to use that, basically to keep a distance from Foreman in the fight, because they thought that was their best chance of victory. And Muhammad Ali went into the fight, and by the way, he was the underdog in this fight as well. Muhammad Ali in the first round, if you watch the tape, he is initially doing the kind of dancing around and stuff, but I think he probably realised that he didn't have the legs for it at that time. He was 32 years old, but he was an old 32 years old with the fights that he'd had until there. By contrast, Foreman was 25 years old, so infamously, Ali from the second round onwards does we all know what this is, the rope-a-dope technique, and he gets Foreman to punch himself out. I'm not going to go too much into that because it's something people are quite familiar with, but I wanted to say this as well. I believe with the technology and everything that we've got nowadays to plug, data and evidence into AI systems and data sets, I think if you were to run a simulator basically with Ali's attributes at that stage, and similarly with Foreman, if you were to run a simulator with those two guys in a computer, on paper as it were, I think that simulator would show that Foreman would win at least 7 or 8 times out of 10 if they were to fight that many times in those conditions. I think this was really a fight that it was just written that Ali would win the fight somehow, some way. And I'm getting a notification here about performance issues. I'm sure that's not about me. That's more technical things. So let me just try that there. So Ali wasn't supposed to win this fight. Not just the bookmakers, not just journalists, not just the pundits and what have you. You had really credible, knowledgeable. Sorry, I'm gonna close all these tabs here. Sorry, because it's given me this these notifications. Right, I'll plough on now. And I've lost my trail of thought, but I believe it was that yes, lots of people, learned people in boxing, including the legendary Sugar Ray Robinson, in particular, tells this story about how he went to a chapel, he went to a church before the fight, and said a prayer to God to to pray that Ali would not only not get hurt, but would leave the ring with his life intact. That was what the thought was going into this, and Ali, that he was going to get seriously hurt in this fight. So the odds were completely against Ali. Foreman was massively expected to prevail in this, and that also informed how Foreman fought in the fight. He says himself that he says himself that he went into the early rounds of the fight literally just trying to take Ali out, just throwing these big bombs, trying to take him out early doors, partly because he was believing the hype that he was reading, that he was supposed to take Ali out within 2 or 3 rounds. So once again, guys, whether you're watching live or watching a recording, I'm gonna I feel like I'm again going 100 miles an hour. I'm just gonna pause here, take a drink, take a breath, and pace myself for the last few rounds of this recording here. Okay, deep breaths, Stephen. Deep breaths. Okay, I think I'm back. So we were talking about the rumble in the jungle, how hardly anybody thought Ali was going to win, including his own team. By the way, Ali's dressing room was supposed to have a morgue or a funeral like atmosphere pre the fight, which really says something. And so it was just extraordinary watching it. If you've not seen it, I believe it's 8 rounds. Yeah, that's right. Ali gets the stoppage in the 8th round. So I just really encourage you, if you've not seen it yet, it's very, very significant. And I think this is emblematic, if you like. I said, what's the significance of Foreman's life and his career? Though he lost the fight, and he was totally devastated for a period after this as well, I think Ali was supposed to win that fight. There were so many things which happened one way or another, which, taking nothing away from Ali, not making any excuses for Foreman, things played out in a certain very unique way, and things happened exactly as they were supposed to. And I think precisely because it led Foreman to have such a crisis, it was his first loss. He lost his heavyweight title, something he'd invested so much of his identity into. And when he lost that, he talks about how he felt like people around him had lost respect for him, and so on. That he really had a very wayward period after that. I'm looking at his boxing record here. He had a number of fights here. Bear with me, sorry. He had about 5 or 6 fights after the Rumble in the Jungle, including a rematch against Joe Frazier, which he won, another stoppage. And he ends up retiring at 28 years old after a loss against someone called Jimmy Young in Puerto Rico. And, just to give you the context of this, Foreman was devastated. He was angry. He was resentful that Ali was not giving him the rematch that he thought he deserved. And Foreman was doing all these stunts at this stage. He fought five guys in one night as a part of this exhibition, but they weren't. They were hardly, world class opposition. They were tomato cans, to use a phrase. And so Foreman had lost his way, and then by the time he fights Jimmy Young in '77 in Puerto Rico, he's heat exhausted. He goes backstage and he was so dehydrated that he has what he described as a religious experience, which led him to, conclude that he should retire in his prime, basically, that he should give up boxing and go into becoming a preacher, which is, a very big turnaround for somebody who had a pretty good career. In fact, an exceptional career up until that point, to just jack it all in after having this experience where he says he found Jesus and Jesus appeared to him and called him to live a life of service. And one of the phrases that Foreman used, and I'm heavily paraphrasing here, guys, was that Jesus said to him, I don't want your money, I want you. And Foreman had the realization, as he put it, again I'm paraphrasing, to say, before that experience I was going to Zaire, Africa, I was going to South America and Europe and all these places, and I was trying to exalt one person, me. I was trying to exalt George Foreman, and now I want to exalt Jesus Christ and live a life which glorifies him and is in service and contribution to him and his kingdom. So Foreman is out of the ring for 10 years. I want to really speed up here as I'm 27 minutes in. He's out of the ring for 10 years, and then all of a sudden, because he's poured so much of his own money into a local community project for local young guys who are like him, who didn't seem to have many opportunities to get on, and I think there was a boxing gym in the community centre as well. He basically came out of retirement for money. He came out after 10 years to raise money for this community centre. And I think it's just, to me, that's just so inspiring. A motivation to go back into the ring. And he's a different person. He's a changed person. He's calmer. He's, the anger isn't there anymore. He's a man of God. And he's let go of that resentment about losing the Rumble in the Jungle and losing to Ali. He's let all that go. He's actually a more likeable person now. He's lost this kind of persona which he played up to about being angry and stern and all this sort of thing. So he comes back, and a long story short, he fights Evander Holyfield and gives a very good account of himself, among other people. He loses to Evander Holyfield, a close decision, but he wins a lot of credit. He fights Tommy Morrison, a young guy in '93, and Foreman is 44 years old and a lot heavier. And by the way, he's playing up to his weight here. It was something he was sensitive about when he was younger. But he's playing up to it. He's eating hamburgers while he's running. He's, getting his belly out at press conferences and all this. He loses to Tommy Morrison. Quite a clear-cut decision. That's for one of the heavyweight titles. And people think that's basically the end of him and that he should retire. But then he gets one more opportunity, and it's really clear by this stage. At the age of 45, in November 1994, MGM Grand Arena in Nevada, in Vegas, he has one final bite at the cherry. He's fighting Michael Moorer, who has just beaten Evander Holyfield for the World Heavyweight Championship of the World. He's the guy who beat the guy. Foreman knows this is his last roll of the dice, the last dance here, and for 9 rounds against a much younger, faster, fitter opponent, Foreman Foreman loses all those 9 rounds. Admittedly, he's not trying to win the rounds. He makes that very clear. He loses the first 9 rounds comfortably, and he's fighting very, very strategically at this stage. He knows that the last thing to leave a fighter as they age is the power, and you know, my lord, by God, if there's one thing Foreman had, it was punching power. So he knows he's got that, and he's. If you watch one of the documentaries about it, it tells this story fantastically that Foreman is just waiting for that one moment. He's waiting for that moment to land that right hand. Mora, his opponent, had done a pretty good job for 9 rounds to stay away from that. You know, but he's getting greedy. He's landing shots, I suppose, on Foreman, and Foreman notices his opponent's starting to get greedy. His feet are starting to stay in what's called the pocket. He's throwing punches, but instead of moving away, he's did you like that there? He he's staying in range. So he's throwing punches, but he's keeping his feet there. Partly for complacency, maybe he's lazy, or because he's tired, or for whatever reason, it's an easy thing to do. And Foreman is starting to think that he's got a chance here, and so you'll see in the replay, and you'll see it in one of the documentaries, that to set up this final right hand here, Foreman throws 2 big left hooks, and they miss reasonably wildly. Does that make sense? They miss wildly. He throws 2 wild left hooks, and they miss by a good distance. But they were thrown for strategic reasons. They were thrown to stop Mora moving to his right hand side, and to keep him in range of the right hand. And then, sure enough, a matter of seconds later, I guess, Foreman strikes, and he throws that right hand. It lands perfectly on the chin of Michael Mora. Mora goes down, and it's very clear when he hits the canvas, though he does his best to stir to consciousness and get up, that he's not going to beat the count. He's effectively been knocked unconscious. And it happened. It happened. George Foreman became a 2-time world heavyweight champion, the oldest heavyweight champion in history to this day, at the age of 45 years old. And it's just absolutely one of those unbelievable sporting achievements. And at this point, I want to just start to wind this video down with a particular quote here, which has been written. I got this from the LA Times. This is from 1993, so this is actually before he won the title for the second and the last time. So it says, George Foreman is an American heirloom. There's never been anything like him. One of the hoariest, there's a word, cliches of the fight game is, they never come back. George came back. And came back he did. Came back he did. And I don't think there's much left to say here. I've got a whole series of directions, I guess, I could go with this, and I've got notes here in front of me. I'll just try and tie them, a few of them together. That, you know, it's very interesting to me that Foreman talks very openly about how he was very, very fearful before both his first fight with Joe Frazier and also against Ken Norton. And there's a moment where he talks about wanting to really engage Joe Frazier in the stare-off, the standoff, and stare him down in his eyes, because he didn't want Frazier to look down at his feet and legs, which were trembling at the time. That's how fearful he was. So he was clearly someone who was able to leverage and manage his fear and really deploy it very, very effectively, as he was able to knock both them guys out within 2 rounds. By contrast, before the Rumble in the Jungle, he was so heavily favoured. He says outright, he said, I wasn't afraid of Ali. And he didn't fight with that fear and that jeopardy and that danger. And maybe if he had done, maybe it would have been a different outcome. So there's something around there about fear. I haven't tied that up in a shareable sentence just yet, but fear can be leveraged. Fear can be utilised. Can be used effectively. That's one of the things I'm struck by when I look at George Foreman's life and his career. Another thought I have is, as I mentioned before when talking about the Rumble in the Jungle, that things happen exactly as they're supposed to. And if there is such a thing as divine intervention, is that if you believe, like I do, that there's a divine order out there in the universe and here on planet Earth, and things happen exactly how they're supposed to, when they're supposed to, as they're supposed to, I think the Rumble in the Jungle is just a very, very well-known example of that. It's a massive part of Muhammad Ali's mythology and his aura, if you like, his comeback story. It's also a very big story in George Foreman's life, his career and his story, if you like. And had he won that fight, I think we're talking in different terms about both of them. They still would be remembered as great fighters and likely as great people, big characters with great impact, but it seemed like that night in Zaire in 1974, events were supposed to play out like that. Everything happened like that. Ali was supposed to, he was supposed to have that insight, that the way to fight George Foreman, this puncher who, would punch cattle carcasses non-stop for 2 minutes, for rounds on end, who he had convinced almost everybody who knew anything about boxing that not only was he going to beat Ali in that fight, but that he was going to hurt him, perhaps permanently. That Ali had that insight that the way to fight Foreman, bizarrely, was to stand there right in front of him and take his shots. And yes, to cover up, to block the punches and roll and take the sting out of them. But still, to stand in front of him and sort of give up that foot speed advantage, that skill advantage. I found that utterly extraordinary. The whole thing utterly extraordinary. Perhaps in ways that I'm not able yet to fully articulate what I mean. And then a couple more reflections to share is patience. Now, I could learn a thing or two, I think, about this patience. And at that point, I'm going to have a patient sip of my peppermint tea here. Foreman, in his early years, was in a hurry, and for good reason. He was trying to do well for himself, do well for his family, for his community, for his people, for Black Americans, for all of America, for himself. And he was in a hurry, and he blasted people out in the boxing ring, at the Olympics, in the pro ranks, and he took out some legends of the sport, some all-time greats, including Joe Frazier. He took Frazier's undefeated record. He lifts him off the canvas. He drops him 6 times, ices him in 2 rounds, and does more or less the same thing with Ken Norton, another generational great in the heavyweight division who beat Muhammad Ali as well. But one of the reflections I have about Foreman, in the 10 years he was out of the ring, and when he discovered religion, when he discovered purpose, when he spent all that time building that community centre and wanting to give back to young people in his area of Texas, he was called upon to go back into the ring, and he had to be patient. He had to have a different style. His stamina was not what it was. His reflexes weren't there. His legs weren't there in his 40s. But he had that punching power. And he had to take a couple of losses as well. And he had to take a lot of criticism. People saying he's crazy. He's coming back for the wrong reasons. And that he shouldn't be fighting these younger guys. He had to deal with a lot. But he had patience. And he had the patience to throw that shot in that fight against Michael Moorer. And I've hardly talked about this. The George Foreman grills, it ended up making him an absolute fortune, to the tune of about $200 million, if I'm not mistaken, or thereabouts. And he had the patience, he had the foresight to negotiate quite a good deal there and leave a fantastic legacy there. And then finally, related to that, with that patience, I think Foreman became more accepting of who he was. Because as I say, when he was younger, he was influenced a lot by fighters like Sonny Liston, who, seemed to have a very big chip on their shoulder, would be very surly and, were very grumpy and, abrasive with journalists, and, they weren't really that approachable. The young Foreman seemed to model himself on that, but the second incarnation, if you like, of George Foreman was a more laid back, a more chilled, a more likeable, personable, and more funny, and yes, more patient guy. And people loved him, I'm sure. I don't know. I didn't know him personally, but he always came across very well to me on any interviews that I've seen. But I've heard people who knew him talk about the sort of person that he was. And I think once he let go of that anger and resentment for all sorts of things which happened to him when he was very young, and as he was coming up through boxing, things I can sympathise with. I think Ali won the Rumble in the Jungle, probably the most famous fight in history. He won it fair and square, but I also think that count, the referee did not give Foreman much of a chance to clear his head, which is something they did a lot more of back then. And he was the champion. So there were things which happened in Foreman's life and in his career which I think lots of other people can look back on and see why that led Foreman to to carry a lot of negative emotions around. But it was only when he was able to set all that aside and through the experience he had finding Jesus, as he put it, the religious experience, when he's able to set all that to one side and forgive Ali and give him full credit for beating him and letting go of the rematch which never presented itself. It was only then when Foreman was able to grow into his glory and be his true higher self. Getting very spiritual here. Getting very using lots of lofty language, but it's coming from the heart. It's coming from a place I believe very strongly. And if it hasn't been made clear already, I feel incredibly inspired by everything that George Foreman was able to achieve. He had 12 children. He died at the age of 76. It was relatively out of the blue, from what I can tell. And as others have said so far, in their own eulogies, I suppose, about Foreman to people who did really know him. I'm just a boxing observer, a boxing fan from the outside. I do agree with them when they say things like, we shall probably never see his like again. And similarly with Ali, Joe Frazier, Ken Norton, I don't think we'll have an era where we'll see these really, really big, interesting characters all coming around at the same time. And maybe that's partly because of the way we cover as a society, as the media, I suppose, the way we cover athletes nowadays. I'm not sure we'll have a similar. We'll get to a similar place. And so, George Foreman, oldest heavyweight boxing champion in history, even now, many years later in 2025. Successful entrepreneur, Christian preacher, among other things. Very his loss will be felt greatly in the United States in particular, and his family, and in his local community in Texas. And I hope you enjoyed this monologue of mine, and thank you for persevering. If you've listened all the way to the end, thank you for persevering. You can probably tell that this is not something that I do often. It's something I'd like to do more of, and pace myself a bit better. And I'm feeling more grounded in this ending part of the video now. I'm taking my time, and I thank you very much for joining me. And please share your comments, observations, thoughts, memories. Happy to hear it all, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for stopping by.